In the first scene, a young black man called Andre walks alone down a well-maintained suburban street at night. A small sports car approaches and begins to follow him. Andre is scared, says, "Fuck this shit," and turns around to walk back the way he came. When he turns to see what happened to the car, he notices that it is still parked where it was, but the door is open. A man with a medieval helmet approaches Andre, knocks him unconscious, and drags his body to the automobile. Rose comes at the flat of her photographer lover Chris, Daniel Kaluuya, with cakes and coffee. They're about to leave for the weekend to visit her family, and he's worried that they won't realize she's dating a black man. She assures him that, while they will almost certainly say silly things, they are really progressive. If he could, her father would have voted for Obama a third time. Chris asks if he's the only black guy she's ever dated, and she admits that he is, but she's convinced her parents would approve. Chris reaches for a cigarette on the way to her parents' house, but Rose snatches it and throws it out the window, warning that her parents would be furious that she dated a smoker. Chris phones his friend Rod, a TSA employee at the nearby airport, to warn him to look after his dog and not feed him people food. Rod chastises Chris for dating a white woman and tells him that visiting white people is a terrible idea. He often flirts with Rose, and Rose finds it endearing when Chris becomes envious. A deer darts out in front of the automobile and is hit as they are engrossed in discussion and not paying attention to the road. They pull over to investigate and call the cops, who inquire as to why they are in the area. Rose informs them that they are on their way to see her family, who reside nearby. The police requests Chris's identification, but Rose intervenes, stating that there is no need because he was not driving. The officer lets them go, and Chris tells Rose that it was great that she stood up to the racist cop for him. Rose and Chris arrive at her parents' house. Dean Armitage, her father, is an endearing neurosurgeon who, indeed, informs Chris that he would have voted for Obama a third time if he could. Missy, Catherine Keener, her mother, is a weirdly icy hypnotherapist. She offers to hypnotize Chris to cure him of his smoking addiction, but he isn't comfortable having strangers in his thoughts. Walter, Marcus Henderson, the groundskeeper, and Georgina, Betty Gabriel, the maid/housekeeper, are also on-site black assistants for the Armitages. Dean admits that it appears horrible, two wealthy white people with two black helpers, but they were hired to care for his parents, and Dean would have felt bad letting them go. Walter and Georgina both have an unsettling aura about them. They have a rigid, false step-forward civility about them. They also both talk in archaic vernacular. Dean leads Chris around the house and displays old family photos. Dean claims that his father was a track and field athlete who was defeated by Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics in front of Hitler. While this was heartbreaking for his father, it was great to see Hitler's Aryan ideals disproved. Rose's brother, who will be joining them later, is also depicted. He, like his father, is a surgeon, although he had a tough patch. The family gathers for afternoon tea. Missy stirs her tea and taps her spoon 3 times against the teacup, critical later. Missy inquires about Chris's parents. Chris alleges that his father abandoned him when he was a child, and that his mother died when he was 11 after being hit by a car. Missy advises Georgina to lie down and rest when she short-circuits while pouring tea. The Armitages inform Rose that their big party is tomorrow. She is taken aback, and they remind her that it is the same day every year. Jeremy, Rose's brother, comes. He's a spoiled, aggressive affluent child. At dinner that night, a drunk Jeremy begins talking to Chris about MMA combat, claiming that Chris would be a natural because he comes from a strong family. He wants to spar, but Chris explains he has rules against sparring with drunks. Dean and Missy suggest that Jeremy retire for the night. Chris and Rose retire to their room, where she apologizes to her family before falling asleep. Chris wakes up in the middle of the night and decides to slip out for a cigarette. Outside, he notices something charging at him in the distance. Walter here. He heads straight for Chris, but at the last second, he takes a sudden detour and flees in another direction. Georgina is looking out a window within the house. It turns out she's looking at herself, not Chris. Chris decides to return inside after she changes her hair. Missy startles Chris by turning on a light before he can return to his bed. She thinks smoking is a nasty habit and offers to help him quit once more. He sits but mocks the idea of hypnosis, unknowing that she is gradually hypnotizing him with her teaspoon as a focal object. She transports him back to the night his mother died when he was 11 years old, and he tells her that his mother didn't come home from work, and he was too terrified to do anything, like call the police, that would confirm it, so he simply sat watching TV, nervously pressing his nails into his bedposts. Chris now is doing the same thing, digging his claws into the chair's arms. She taps her teacup 3 times with her spoon and instructs him to sink. Chris, 11, sinks into his bed, while Chris, now, sinks into darkness, seeing himself and Missy high above. His consciousness has left his paralyzed body on the chair. He checks his phone first thing in the morning. Rod texted Chris a photo of himself pretending to feed his dog beer. Because his battery is running low, he plugs it in. Chris informs Rose that he believes her mother hypnotized him last night. He has only hazy memories of the event. The wealthy friends of the Armitages arrive for the big party. Many older white people make inappropriate comments to Chris, such as how he has a good build, that because Tiger Woods golfs, he must have a good swing, that black guys are better in bed, and so on. Chris walks away and meets a blind man named Jim Hudson, Stephen Root, who claims that everyone at the party is stupid. He's an art dealer, and Chris knows who he is. Jim expresses admiration for Chris's efforts. He recognizes the absurdity of a blind art dealer, but informs him that he has a fantastic assistant who is excellent at describing works. He admires Chris's eyes. Jim claims he tried photography but was never very successful at it. When Chris returns to mingling with the guests, he notices another black man. He's Chris's age, and Chris tries to connect with him, but he, like Walter and Georgina, is rigid and unnatural. But Chris notices something familiar about him. The astute observer will realize that this is Andre from the opening scene. Chris decides to check in with Rod again, and his phone is once again unplugged. He plugs it in, dials Rod, and tells him everything that's happened. Rod informs him that white people enjoy having sex slaves and that he needs to leave. When Rose finds Chris, he tells her how strange everything is and that his phone has been unplugged yet again. She tells him that he's just being worried because he's in an awkward circumstance. He agrees, and she walks away. Rod instructs Chris to photograph the black man and see if he recognizes him. Georgina stops Chris as he prepares to leave, apologizing for unplugging his cell phone. She lifted it up while dusting the nightstand, and when it came unplugged, she didn't want to tamper with it any further. He replies it's all right and that he didn't mean to inform her. She doesn't get it. So he clarifies that he had no intention of getting her in trouble. She acts strangely and sheds a single tear as she tells him that the Armitages treat her like family. Chris returns outside and attempts to photograph the familiar black man quietly with his cell phone, but he has neglected to turn off the flash. The dude shifts as soon as his phone flashes. He transitions from prim and respectable to raving. His nose begins to bleed, and he yells at Chris, "Get out. Get the F***ck out while you can." Rose is also terrified. When she asks her father what happened, he says that the flash just caused the man to have a seizure. The man emerges, apologizes for upsetting everyone, and states that he must return home. Chris and Rose go for a walk, and Chris informs her that he believes he recognized the man and that something unusual is obviously happening. She agrees, stating that it did not appear to be a seizure. Chris expresses a strong desire to return home. Rose grudgingly concurs. She promises to make up a story to tell her parents. Dean is hosting a silent auction with his guests, who are holding up bingo cards to bid. A photo of Chris is next to him. The auction is won by Jim Hudson. The other guests had all left. Chris begins packing his possessions when he receives a call from Rod, who informs him that the man in the photograph is a man they knew named Dre, who used to work at a movie theater but went missing a few weeks ago. The phone's battery has died. Chris notices the closet door is ajar. He looks inside and discovers a box packed with images of Rose posing lovingly with a variety of other black men. There are also pictures of her with Walter and Georgina, who are nothing like the artificial versions Chris has encountered. After all, Chris isn't the first black guy Rose has dated. Rose returns, and Chris informs her that he requires the keys in order to load their belongings into the car. As they leave the house, she searches for them in her purse. Jeremy appears unexpectedly, blocking the front entrance. Dean and Missy are also present. Jeremy is about to launch an attack when Missy and Dean tell him to calm down. Chris constantly telling Rose that she needs to fetch the keys. Missy and Dean express their dissatisfaction with Chris's departure. Chris requests the keys once more, and Rose responds calmly, "You know I can't give you the keys." Chris finally realizes that Rose is also involved in whatever is going on. Jeremy assaults Chris. Dean yells, and Missy clinks the teaspoon on her glass, sending Chris back into the darkness. Meanwhile, Rod continues to attempt to contact Chris, but his calls are being sent to voicemail. He checks up the image of the man in the photo and discovers that he has been missing for some time, so he contacts the police. He tells a female officer that his son, like the missing man in the picture, was stolen by white people to be a sex slave. She summons 2 more officers to hear Rod's story. They all busted out laughing when he finished. Nobody is going to take him seriously. Chris wakes up bound to a chair in front of a mounted deer head and an antique television screen. He sees a film prepared by Dean's father about immortality and other topics. Chris notices that his fingernails have pierced the leather arm of the chair, exposing the padding. The teacup and spoon reappeared on the screen. Ting ting ting, he's gone. Rod dials Chris's number again, and Rose answers. She lies when she says Chris left 2 days ago and is concerned about his whereabouts. He allegedly departed in a taxi or an Uber, according to her. Rod informs her that he went to the police station, and she appears anxious. He realizes something is awry and attempts to record the call, but when he resumes speaking with her, she tells him she knows he has feelings for her. He tells her she's a crazy woman and hangs up the phone. Jim Hudson appears on the television as Chris awakens. He informs Chris that they would be exchanging ideas. The other guests at the party were all about being black, but Jim couldn't care less. What he really wants is to experience the world through Chris's eyes. Dean has perfected the neurosurgery that allows all of this to happen. Missy also hypnotizes the body donors in order to prepare them for the process. He will remain in the dark abyss, but he will be able to continue as a passenger. As they witnessed previously at the party, the flashing is an unwelcome side effect. Chris is out again with the ting 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 of the teaspoon. Jim Hudson is being prepared for a brain transplant by Dean and Jeremy. Dean directs Jeremy to locate Chris. Jeremy walks down the hall. We now know they were in the house's basement, and discovers Chris unconscious. He removes his cuffs and prepares an IV. Chris wasn't unconscious after all, he'd shoved chair cushion in his ears to muffle the sound of the teaspoon. He knocks Jeremy unconscious. Dean summons Jeremy and searches the lab area for him. Chris charges at him, impaling him with the deer antlers from the other chamber. He knocks over a candle, which ignites the blanket that is covering Jim Hudson. Rose is wearing headphones and is completely unaware of what is going on. While listening to music, she searches for photographs of attractive black males with good physiques. Chris heads upstairs to look for Missy. She reaches for the teacup and spoon, but Chris outruns her and breaks the cup. Instead, she confronts him with a knife, which he then turns on her and stabs to death. Chris tries again to open the front door, but Jeremy has returned and has him in a choke hold. Chris tries twice to open the front door, but Jeremy kicks it shut. Chris stabs Jeremy in the thigh and smashes his skull with vicious head stomps on the third attempt, as Jeremy kicks the door. He dashes outside and into Jeremy's car. The medieval helmet from previously is on the passenger seat. He begins walking down the driveway but collides with Georgina. He can't just leave her there like he did his mother, so he loads her into the car and drives down the driveway. She stirs and assaults him. Her wig falls off during the surgery, and we notice she has a scar across her head from a brain transplant as well. They collide with a tree, and she perishes. Rose is listening to this through her earbuds. The rearview mirror is suddenly blasted away. Rose is pursuing Chris with a rifle. He urges her to stop, but she notices Georgina and addresses her as Grandma. Rose shoots again, but this time she misses Chris. Walter appears out of nowhere in pursuit of Chris, and Rose exclaims, "Get him, Grandpa," as he tackles Chris. They wrestle on the ground, and Chris photographs him. Flash! Walter turns to Rose and asks for her firearm. He shoots her in the stomach before turning the weapon on himself after she delivers it to him. Rose is bleeding to death on the ground. She reaches for the weapon, but Chris swats it away. Rose places a hand on Chris's cheek and tells him she loves him as he bends over her. Chris begins to choke Rose but pauses because he is unable to continue. A police car approaches. Rose begs for aid, knowing that the local cops would arrest Chris. But it's Rod who gets out of the cop car. Chris climbs into his automobile. Rod looks around at the mayhem and exclaims, "Man, I told you not to go in that house." When Chris asks how Rod found him, Rod says he works for the TSA and that everything will be fine. As Rod and Chris drive away into the night, Rose smiles with her last breath. Rod drives Chris away from the scene as Rose lies dead in the road at the end of the film.